afternoon, and to the 75 or 80,000 people watching this as we're streaming it. Hello out there. So it's not just the few of us here. Before I introduce everybody and we get into this discussion, I find it helps us to understand a little bit who's in the audience. So if you're an artist, could you raise your hand, please? If you're someone who's in the gallery business, raise your hand. Okay. If you were just looking for free air conditioning, raise your hand. If a journalist, raise your hand. Okay, and I suppose I left out curators. We're going to take a fairly free-form look at global business models and the art world. But first, let me do a very 30-second introduction to everybody, and then I'm going to ask a question, and hopefully we'll get started. And at the end, after about a half hour, we'll have time for some questions. So today, you're probably the least well-rounded in that you've been a gallerist for well over 30 years, I'd say, staying in one specific kind of field, whereas this is Thaddaeus from Austria, France, and England now with galleries. John here has been a curator, and he's an academic as well, and we're all going to go afterwards and do his book signing for the book Art in the Global Economy. That's going to be right after. So, and Juan here has been quite international, not just working in Europe, but also North America and South America and Central America, I suppose. So the idea of this globalization, which is a big word that everybody's been talking about in terms of art and the art world, what I wanted to start with is does that favor a certain kind of artist? Is there an artist that's more likely to prosper in this sort of global art world now as that more than another? Does it help somebody or hurt somebody else?
I would not think so. I think, the art world is very open to different forms of creation. I think very curious, even maybe more curious than maybe in former days when you see how, contemporary museums kind of flourish and people are really curious to see the newest productions of younger artists. I think there is not one formula of an artist who is more successful globally versus regionally. I really think there is a strong curiosity. There was an exhibition in Paris in 1989 at the Centre Pompidou, and maybe it was too early back then. It was called Les Messagiens de la Terre, and it was the first time a curator, or he was the director of the museum, brought together artists from all over the world. He went to the deepest jungle and found artists. And back then I felt the audience was not there yet, because people in Europe were looking to America, America was looking to Europe, and this has all changed. I think today we are interested in all these different corners of the planet, and when we look into gallery programs, we're working with artists who live in Lahore, Pakistan, or in Iran, and 20 years ago this was not common.
John?
I think that, I'm particularly interested in how the channels of communication that globalization has allowed have provided windows into far more worlds than the art world had in 1989. And therefore, artists from what I call the former periphery, because I don't believe the center-periphery dynamic continues to hold, artists from around the world have become much more accessible and visible. It has to do with the internet, of course, but it also has to do with things like Art Basel, art fairs, biennials. Next to Martin's historic exhibition, one could also place the Biennale de Habana from 1989, which featured globalization from a very different perspective, right? But very much sought to bring together a sort of tricontinental of artists from around the world in order to offer an alternative to the Western models that were currently in existence.
I'm not sure what to add. I was just thinking of the fact that it used to be universal art, and now we talk about global art. And somehow it's a completely different framework for understanding a collection of cultural objects. So maybe 30 years ago, 40 years ago, you would talk about universal art, and it was seemed more biased than global, but because global seems more earthbound, I guess. Or I would agree that it benefits all artists. This system. At the same time, I wonder if it's a replaceable category or not, like Universal was. Universal had less distinctions in terms of contemporary or modern and primitive, what was called primitive at the time, but now we have...
Maybe I didn't phrase this in a way that, I mean, clearly the art world is more global, but as I was sort of thinking how artists had to work, it's like, if you're not prolific, I'm not sure that it works in this system. I'm not sure that Leonardo would make it, hey, I only made 14 paintings, you know. It's time for Shanghai Art Fair, and there's the biennial in Bogota, and there's this kind of thing going on in Oslo, that the globalness of the art factory or machine or economy, I'm wondering if it's forcing us into, not to put down Damien Hirst, but to mirror Damien Hirst more than Vermeer, because that's the way forward to get gallery shows, to get museum shows. So maybe if we look at it, trying to dig one level down, not that the audience isn't global or the internet isn't global, but the art that's being made has to somehow, this is my hypothesis, you know, and if that's how we're going, and is that good or bad, and how do you put your role into that?
Well, I think this is a very superficial view of things, and I really disagree totally, because I think we see in today's art world artists who produce a lot and can really cater to all these demands of art fairs, and we have many artists who still produce very little, and it didn't hurt their career at all. I think it's a very different way to look at art, and I do hope that people do not reduce their consume of art to art fairs, and they do go to see exhibitions and museums, and I really feel there is no need to be worried about that people wouldn't really go behind just what they see at the next art fair. And you know, in my case, we are very careful, and when I hear that some galleries do up to 80% of their turnover at art fairs, I find this very worrying, because I think, you know, we try our utmost to prepare a space with a perfect condition for an artist. And
so are those galleries searching for artists whose work functions in the art fair system, and are they pre-selecting people that work well in the narrow confines that aren't ideal of doing exhibitions and things like that? I'm not saying
well, it's all about relevance, you know, and I think everybody who has a gallery, you know, has first to get the respect of the artist, to be able to really have access to the work, and then, you know, gain the respect of the art community and of the collectors. So in a way, well, there's a lot of art fairs, and there, you know, when you just look in Miami now, I think besides Art Basel, there are many other art fairs who are trying to invite artists to show their art, and galleries who show their kind of stable. I still hope that we are not going extremely in this direction, because I still believe very much in the gallery model, and in our case we are very careful that our main activity is still in the different galleries, and we're very happy that artists giving us exhibitions which has to do with the space, if it's in London or Paris or Salzburg, and that we invite our audience to experience the art in this space, and I always say the art fair is a bit the icing of the cake in terms of real, you know, turnover and to meet people, but we cannot reduce our activity to what we are doing in a small booth with bad flora. This one is a bit better now than in other cases, bad light, terrible walls, bad air. So I think, we are reducing everything we are living for in terms of our spaces to the minimum. And I don't want to be pitchy on art fairs now,
but today, so you disagree that that a lot of the art is being affected by this global economy. Do you take, which way do you two weigh in on this?
I just don't think it's a simple thing of one global art market influencing the way art is made. I think it's a system that operates in a very complex way, and if you look at it historically, you also have the same problem. You have also certain artists. The art world, let's say, has these sort of it defines itself, and if you want to be part of it, in a certain way, you have to learn how to be part of it, as an artist, as a curator, as a director, a gallerist. And I don't think we would see a deficiency of the global art world compared to something that came before it, or I wouldn't be able to compare historically the context of Leonardo and the context of Jeff Koons. It's a completely different way of patronage, form of patronage. I mean, these people had direct patrons. The artists now don't know who their patrons are. It's a completely different reality. So I don't think it defines the way art is made more than the artists themselves define how art behaves in the present, right?
Yeah, I would underscore that. And I mean, I do think, Josh, that the contemporary art market is clearly expanded and accelerated, right? There's quite a pace to it now. But while that does favor some people who are very productive and who hire studio assistants to help them be even more productive, it also, I believe, is more inclusive, as Thaddaeus was saying, in that sense that it brings more people into the art world as we know it. And so therefore, there are going to be hyper-productive artists, and there are going to be artists who are less productive, and all of them will have an opportunity, I think, because there are so many more opportunities.
Can I throw in another example of, Leonardo Cana? What do you think? How many portraits Cana painted of Luther? I don't know. If you would have asked me 2-3 years ago, I would have said maybe 10. We know the ones in the museums in Vienna and in Basel. Actually, he painted almost 500 at his time, and he had a system where he was sending some dealers across Germany, and they would make little art fairs in Munich and near Vienna, and he would just take out these portraits. And the Reformist movement demanded a lot of portraits of Luther, and Dürer wanted to paint Luther, but the Duke of Saxony gave the monopoly to Cranach, and Cranach was very, very clever to kind of not give up on the, and Dürer came to see him and said, can I please do one portrait? I said, no, I really, this is my market. So in a way, I don't think we are so far off, and the way he sent his agents across Europe with their little art fair booth by offering maybe 5 portraits of Luther and to say, okay, I'm just mounting this in this little, kind of, I don't know, horse stop or wherever, they would come and see some art. And he would sell these portraits, and they would really go into all these new Reformist homes and new churches. So I think, we always think everything is new and everything is now and yet, and everything was reinvented. I think it's different, definitely, because we are living in a different world, but I think we are not so far off, and I think we are still about relevance, and we are still about artists producing on their own in their studio for an art world who is very critical, who is very demanding, who also wants to experience the real thing, and not just something, which would fill in some commercial needs.
Well, bringing up commercial needs, it seems like there's a bit of a crossover going on between the roles of what the gallery does, a museum does, a critic does, a collector does now, and it's been going on, that's not brand new, but it's been going on for a while, where the museums are having to be a little bit more commercial in terms of how do they pay for their shows and how do they raise their money, and the galleries are having the opportunity, because things are so expensive, to be a little bit more curatorial in putting on museum quality shows. If somebody wants to talk about if they see, I don't think most of you will disagree with me on that part of the analysis, what it might mean going forward, and if that's going to hold, or if where we might be now or going in terms of those overlaps of experience, and people are floating back and forward in that world.
I mean, I think one of the hallmarks of that transformation that you're talking about is the private museum. And in some sense, that represents a fusion of what we might have previously conceived of as public and private. In other words, here's a private collector opening a public museum. And therefore, you can see a kind of impact. Needless to say, these projects are often called vanity museums, right? But the idea is that an individual collector, this goes back a long ways, right? We could think of Albert Barnes, who really wanted to see his collection in a particular way and was not good at making he didn't like the idea of his collection being diffused into a broader universal museum. He wanted people to be able to perceive the links and the connections, the new ways of looking at modern art that he saw. I think today we see the private museums are mushrooming, and that shows us that there are a lot of people that have large collections that are wanting to share them with the public. But as far as museums and galleries overlapping, I think they have been for a long time. Maybe it's becoming a little bit more obvious now.
Well, just to touch that point for a second before we have another remark, I mean, I think the statistic was over 50% of the exhibitions at the major museums in America came from artists in 4 or 5 galleries in the last few years. So.
Well, I'm not fond of statistics. I think maybe 10 years ago it would have seemed like a problem. What in my experience now is that galleries and museums, publicly minded museums, which is not all public museums, not all private museums are privately minded, not all public museums are publicly minded. Let's say publicly minded museums and galleries have been getting closer in order to improve these public collections, because we all see it's impossible for a museum to participate in the art market now at the prices that are, that works go for, even for younger artists. So what I see 2 things in your question that are relevant to me. One is that we have been forced to define our places more clearly, which is a good thing, in my opinion. As a director of a public museum, it is important to know what the position of this place is in relation to the public, who its stakeholders are, and what are the limits one can impose on private interests, even when they are helping the institution, right? Of course, there are all these statistics that go around. They change yearly. I mean, the content stays, the adjectives change. The other thing that is interesting to me is to see how lately, my experience at least, to see that galleries, artists, public institutions are trying to solve this problem in a productive way. Because in the end, these institutions, we hold collections that are not biased, are not so oriented towards a specific private interest, but for a public interest. And
it's becoming more fluid. I'd agree. Over 10 years ago,
yeah.
I mean, today you've hired the director of the Serpentine to work for you. Aquavella hired Philippe de Montebello to work for you. That seems a more cooperative kind of, we're in this all together. What kind of feeling in some ways?
Those examples are, you know, pension problems. You need to retire and you need to have money. These are individual things. What I'm talking about is the larger thing. Of course, we all want to. We don't earn too much in public institutions. It's a kind of like half, you know, public service, half salary. Julia, you know, all of these people. Not the Montebello, but we.
You mean so being an art advisor and a museum director is not so good simultaneously anymore?
I'm emphatically not talking about individual interests. I'm talking about how we need to be clearer about who we are in this landscape of contemporary art, institutionally, and defend that place and protect it. And I feel that there has been a collective effort to improve the standing of public institutions lately, at least from what I think
for a museum, that's a good way of looking at things, just like defining our audience in that sort of way. But when you throw that to a gallery, it sounds like building a brand.
I think I need to say something now. Well, you know, it's all about relevance at the end of the day. And what we are trying to do is to, based on respect for the artists and their work. It's a big privilege to work with great artists, and they give you their best work. They are kind of trusting their work to you. And then you have to build a context. And the context is not only selling the work. And the least context is to put it at an art fair. And when I was starting to speak to Julia Peyton-Johns, you know, when she decided to leave the Serpentine, is to really kind of get her into my galleries and see if we can really build this relevance for the context we are trying to build. And I have to say, it's a very short experience, only a couple of months, and but it really worked out already really very well, because somebody coming from a museum in such a position looks at art differently, slightly different, and definitely at the market. And what I said to her is also, please look as critical as you can, and you don't need to say this twice to somebody like her, like some of her colleagues. And I think for us, this is a very, very important process, that we, while we grow, which is also not necessary, but possible if we want to grow, to also have, you know, within the gallery, people who are really very carefully looking at the content and the way we deal with artists, the way we build exhibitions, and the way we present art.
John?
I mean, one of the things that happens when we look at statistics is that we lose track of the immediate dimensions of the art world. It's curators who organize exhibitions, and directors, of course, have to approve, boards of directors, etc. But curators have relationships. They have relationships with dealers. They have relationships with people they trust. They have relationships with artists. Those relationships oftentimes have incredible influence on how they act within the public domain of the art museum. And so in some sense, this is another way of thinking about private and public, right? That in some ways, the kinds of decisions that curators make about putting on exhibitions are very immediate. And therefore, the kind of 50% statistic maybe tells us something about the fact that a handful of galleries are very good at representing museum-class artists or so. But that sort of misses the point of the way in which exhibitions, the kind of work it takes to put together an exhibition, and the kinds of relationship building that happens over a career of a curator or a dealer.
I'll just add a small esoterical footnote to all this. I think if we stand from the point of view of the viewer It's a very different experience to go into a public museum, a commercial gallery, or a private museum. Immediately, the context directs you in a certain way and makes you react in a certain way. I don't think there's a better or purer way of looking at art, but definitely the museum as a public institution is a place where art is just not moving anymore. I think it's a meaningful event that cannot be undone by getting closer and making better lighting conditions or anything like that, which is not to judge one over the other. Of course, I direct a museum, so I favor the public museum. But it's an important public event. Where you enter to access art immediately determines a certain relationship to these works. And for me, it's important to remember that the artwork is an effective, intuitive construction. And it's an effective and intuitive encounter that one has with it. You know, so to give an example, when we had this Prada show in Venice of where they redid the Harald Zeeman exhibition, I can't remember the name of the exhibition, when things become form, or attitudes become form. Well, you just saw millions. You didn't see that work anymore. You just saw the millions of dollars invested in moving these works into Venice. The original show is inaccessible to us.
Only 9 people saw the original show.
Yeah.
So it's kind of hard to put it in that context.
Right. So I'm just saying this not in order to put it down, but just to say it's inevitable that you have all these filters added to your experience of the artwork.
Well, let me ask one other sort of general question, then we'll open it up to the audience. A year ago, I sat in this seat, not in this park, but back in the normal fair, and I had some people talking about the effect of the election. One of them happened to be named Podesta, who's maybe been in the news, but it was Heather Podesta, not Tony or John. And I wonder, it's been a year, and certainly, you know, this topic's talking about global, and certainly we've had that as a big topic in America and around the world. I'm wondering to what extent the art world is sort of reacting even stronger against the notion of the national, and that all of you are thinking, because of the political environment, to think not, you know, make America great, but make the world great, or how the effect of this year has been on you professionally. And then we'll open it for questions. Maybe we'll start at the other end and we'll move this way.
Well, as a direct recipient of the lashing out of Trump, I guess, you know, in Mexico, I always felt it was a bit of a comedy, to be honest with you. I've always had a negative reaction to the national thing. It seems to me that it doesn't reflect the world anymore. The way the world behaves cannot be, you know, represented through national belongings in that sense. It's a very political, for me it's a political category in a way. And so there were these attempts to elicit a nationalist, which I'm not Mexican, by the way, so I can't have a nationalist reaction from Mexico. I just saw it as a bizarre comedy where politicians were I just saw Trump as this master of the red herring, and everybody was just biting. You know, all these completely farcical.
But as it relates to art making,
in terms of art making, I haven't felt affected by that the last year any more than before. You know, like in Europe, as you know, there's been a splintering, which I blame on the euro, of, you know, regional fervor. You know, like, so people know where the cheese comes from now. It wasn't the case before, or where the wine comes from, and there's this attachment to the region. So there is a tendency to retreat into your own community that has been happening in Europe before even Trump, or in Germany, you know, like there are very strong opinions about which part of Germany is the real Germany and things like this. So to me, it's been just one more modulation of a long-standing issue in a certain way.
I agree with you, Juan. I think that Trump is a buffoon. And in some sense, there is, I mean, I live in San Francisco, and most people I know are absolutely beside themselves. I mean, it's as if the world ended. And I try to not to take it quite so seriously. And I think that nationalism has certain elements that are actually quite scary, and other elements which are actually completely superficial. You know, Hitler gave nationalism a bad name, and that's what I think everybody's scared of, and the term fascist seems to come into conversation entirely too regularly for my taste. But the fact is that, in some sense, national representation will continue in some form or another, right? We still, you know, we know that Venice, the biennial in Venice was modeled on a kind of Olympics of art, right? All these different pavilions from different nations. This is a holdover from the World's Fairs, in which there was a kind of competition between artists from different nations and prizes were awarded. Those kinds of national sort of identifications have been part of the global dimension of the art world for quite some time. And in some sense, I don't think it's a matter of I mean, I don't think that Trump can overcome globalization. He can throw a wrench in a bunch of different processes, you know, annul trade deals, make a variety of things more difficult, but that doesn't mean that he's going to be able to, you know, the cat's out of the bag, right? And as far as the art world is concerned, there are a lot of artists who do have very specific ideas, you know, statements to make about Trump and his politics, but I don't feel like that in any way changes the global dimension, right? We can proffer nationalism, but it doesn't make us any less global.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I also really think that the art world per se has left this geopolitical idea a long time ago. You know, we opened London 6 months ago in the middle of this whole Brexit discussion, and I was always asked if I'm not afraid of Brexit now with this gallery in London. I said, definitely not. Morally, I'm shocked that it happened because I'm staunchly European. But for the gallery system or for the art world per se, I think the art world lives outside these kind of national borders, you know. Would we know any artist or curator or museum director, maybe with the collectors I would not be so sure, but you know, who really have a kind of national interest in art making or in looking at art? I really don't think so. I think maybe it was never really the case, but it definitely, the 20th century has changed this. Even, you know, before the Second World, before this whole disaster in Germany, artists, you know, were not national artists, besides a few which we have doubts also within their context and their content. So I really think it is not a problem of the art world, you know, borders. And I don't think anyone can create this, not Brexit and not Trump. And I think we are almost like on our own planet.
I'd like to open it up for questions. So if you raise your hand, we'll bring you a mic. And if you can say that you're an artist or a curator or an air conditioning fan, whatever, that'll help us try to answer questions. So I have a hand over here.
I'm just a fan of art, just coming to learn. But I wanted to ask if you feel like because of globalization and these different kind of swings and influence between private and public, that we're going to see trends toward maybe, you know, say public museums become more powerful or private galleries become more powerful or start wielding more influence in terms of the artists they're able to attract or the attention they're able to hold?
I'll take that one. I think that, you know, there's, in the 60s, with sociologists who wrote about art, talked about what was called what they called a dealer-critic system, right? In which critics and dealers helped to cement artistic representations, representation of artists in a broader cultural sphere. And therefore, there's a kind of analysis. Sociologists are always interested in systems and power, and so there's a kind of analysis of what kind of system operates in the art world to produce power. In other words, why does one artist get picked for a museum retrospective over another, right? Isabel Grau, a critic from Germany, has coined the term the collector-dealer system, right? As the sort of phase that we are in now, in order to anoint certain artists with those kinds of reputations that the sociologists of the 60s felt that they had. I think that, both of them are generalizations and they wouldn't apply in all cases, but I do think that we have to acknowledge that with globalization, under the terms of neoliberalism, it has created a much larger class of hyper-wealthy people, and not just in the same old places of New York and London, but indeed all over the world. And so that means that the collectors have a lot more buying power, and that will lead to a kind of impact, right? Does that mean that the public institutions won't have the power to countermand that? I say, look at the Louvre Abu Dhabi, right? There's a public institution that has managed to globalize itself rather effectively and promote its ideals of publicness in an international context, right? So I don't think it means the death knell for public institutions. I just think it shifts the focus and means, I think as Juan articulated earlier, it's very important for public institutions to know who they are, what they're doing, who their audience is, and to develop that in this context.
I would like to add something to this, because I slightly disagree. I don't think we really have this problem so much that the collector kind of influences, taste or the structure of museums. If you look at Documenta in Germany or any of the great biennials, maybe not Venice, because Venice has such a kind of special place, but most of the others, and they are opening every week. I think curators and museum directors are not so impressed by what collectors are really deciding what is great art. And many of the art we believe in strongly, and I do, you will not find in most of these curated exhibitions. So I think curators know what they look at, what they want to show. I mean, and I don't think collectors will change this or dealers will change this. I think these worlds really function very professionally and very focused in. But Thaddaeus,
could you agree that maybe the role of Clement Greenberg is sort of played now by Marion Goodman more than by some writer, and that the role of the critic has been changed in that social media is allowing everybody to be a critic now?
No, I disagree also. I think, I think the power of dealers is really exaggerated in the way it kind of looked at, because really look at Documenta. How many artists in Documenta were really from these kind of galleries who are the tastemakers? Not so many. I think the curators of Documenta and other biennials, they went around the studios and made their decision on their own taste and their own way to look at art, and they were not impressed by powerful galleries.
Do you want to comment, or should we have another question?
You can have another question.
Okay. Do we have another question someplace here?
I'm a collector. Is there any concern in terms of copyrights in this Instagram or YouTube-obsessed society for museums, galleries, and artists?
No. No, not really. Art is so unique. I don't think we have a problem of copyright. If somebody wants to fake something, he does it. I think it's a kind of self-cleaning, self-regulating.
Yes, do the right thing. You should know what the right thing is intuitively.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, from all of your different perspectives, how you see the role of digital platforms in the sphere and ecology of contemporary art. where you think they have an effect that might be sort of a restructuring effect, or whether it sort of reconsolidates existing positions. So when I'm saying digital platforms, I mean obviously things like Arte, but also, you know, we can extend beyond that and imagine other possibilities. So I guess from, you know, from
digital platforms.
I'm tempted to go to Andre Malraux.
John, you live closest to Silicon Valley, so maybe you want to like.
One would hope that it would make people more informed, but they don't. They don't seem to do that either. I think they're useful. For me as a museum director, they're also a problem, a budget problem. They pose this pressure, impose a pressure to make a digital museum, and I'm an orthodox art historian. I believe in the direct contact with the artwork, so I just think a functional website is enough for a museum. The platforms that you're referring to, they don't seem to. They make things accessible. They're useful. I think that's my opinion about them, basically. But they don't seem much more.
Yeah, I was just going to say that the idea of a universal museum, right? It goes back a ways, and in some sense, the technology has made this capacity available to us, so that we can imagine this as not so much an ideal as a reality, but at the same time, it was always a kind of meaningless suggestion, to the degree that it doesn't allow for people to connect with art. It allows for people to like images. It allows for certain artists to trend. Trending now, right? That is far away from the experience of aesthetic appreciation.
I saw these kids. This is totally aside or not. I don't know. I saw these kids in the Venice Biennial. You're very young with 5 cameras around them, and they were always standing in the corner where there was no artwork, taking pictures. And it's like, what is going on here? It's like, she's an Instagram sensation. So she had gone to the Venice Biennial to take pictures of herself in corners where there were no artworks interfering with her image.
As if she herself was an artwork at the Venice Biennial.
Conceptual art, there we go. She'll be showing soon. We have time for one more question, I think. You sure it's a good question? Make sure it's a good question. So wait for the mic, please.
Just for the record, you mentioned the show when attitudes began formed in Venice in the 60s, that they had 9 visitors. Could you throw a little bit? I was
kind of exaggerated, maybe 90.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What about the remake in recent years?
I didn't hear the question.
Yeah.
What about the remake in Venice?
Oh.
I heard there was an episode where there were so many people on the dock, they just fell into the water in the canal. Yeah. So many more in just one moment.
Okay.
What's interesting that a show could be mythical that no one saw.
Yeah.
But the original show was not in Venice, by the way. It was in Bern, Switzerland. So it was, of course, in a very kind of...
Which proves Thaddaeus' point, because it's only mythical because of curators and the few people that knew about it made it mythical, right? Now it's entered into another stage, but it only exists in our imagination now because people talk about it.
But we define ourselves by how many followers we have, and that's probably not the best definition that the 4 of us would like to use as a means of success.
Yes, but I think we shouldn't get too arrogant against this digital era, because in a way it also opens up the art world. I think the art world was very exclusive maybe 30 years ago. It is very inclusive today. I think it really allows everybody to be part of it, and I think digital is part of this invitation. So I think we can laugh about it, we cannot take it serious, and it has a lot of faults, but on the other hand, it really opened up the art world and invited everyone, and I think we should appreciate this invitation to be part of a world which is exciting. And I remember well when you speak to artists of older age, like when George Baselitz told me when he was growing up in Eastern Germany, they didn't have anything, no art books whatsoever, only Russian realism. And you know, they had black and white magazines of works of Pollock and Roscoe, and they were kind of, one artist gave it to the other, they shared this one image, bad image, you hardly could see anything, and they worshipped it. So in a way, I think we live in this luxury world of imagery, which has its fault, but I think it also has its merits.
So we have time for one more question. Somebody has the mic.
More than one of you have mentioned relevance. So my question would be, what makes art relevant, particularly relevant to this particular global situation that you're speaking of?
Wow, this is a question of what is art now. I think we are starting now a 3-day campus here, I would say.
I always answer this. I mean, it's not a sufficient answer, but it's an exchange for me. You know, like it's not like not everybody has to find contemporary art relevant in their lives. They can look at theater and literature, or several of them if they want. We do one thing, and it requires effort. And I think the relevance is in the retribution that you get for making the effort to engage with these aesthetic statements. That's, for me, the most relevant thing that we can offer.
I mean, I guess I would, just to add to that a little, say that there's an incredible amount of relevance in looking at transnational statements, right? Or it's statements that cross borders, right? And that border crossing and our ability to engage with that border crossing on a regular basis without even thinking about it, you know, think about all the artworks that are here and how many different borders they had to cross to get here. We take it for granted in many cases, but I do think that that's a way of adding another dimension of relevance in this particular era.
Anybody have a last word? As we have to, other than buy John's book outside, who would probably be the best last word. And then thank you for coming. Thank you to my panelists.